today we would have had our graduation ceremony on the 23rd of this month. And graduation is something very big in Japan. So we have every year more than 2,000 graduates, which means they and their parents come. And the girls are dressed normally in kimono, in the former Japanese dress, and we rent a big hall in the city, which can hold 10,000 people in order to have this ceremony. It was cancelled now because of the events. Sophia University is a small university, 12,000 students, in the middle of Tokyo, and we have been selected by the Ministry of Education of Japan among the 13 top universities of Japan. And I am very much looking forward to the partnership with the Catholic Institute, with the Catholic University here in Ljubljani. But I would now like to enter the topic of my speech. First of all, what is Europe? That question might seem very easy to answer, but it isn't. It is not easy if you have to define the borders of Europe. So, is Russia part of Europe? Is Turkey part of Europe? And if not, why is Cyprus already part of it? You have a changing identity of Europe from the territory point of view. If you look to maps done 30 years ago, you would find Georgia and Armenia part of Asia. Nowadays, they are part of Europe on the maps. So it's not so clear what Europe is. It's much easier to define Europe by cultural identity. There is a cultural identity in Europe. And this culture of Europe, normally in Europe gets defined or by Christianity or by Enlightenment, sometimes the two together, sometimes Christian identity in Middle Ages, the Enlightenment afterwards taking the succession of the first identity. I would like to show a different identity of Europe from an Asian perspective, which is that Europe is a product of globalization. Europe has been, now it's in danger of losing it, the most globalized culture in the world in the past. I would just like to take some very simple examples of food culture in order to show you the influence we have. For instance, you are in Japan at least, when you go to a French restaurant, you have many plates. And these beautiful plates, in fact, that we use, a plate for everybody for lunch and so on, is Chinese influence. Before the missionaries joined China, European people were used to eat from a big pot in the middle of the table. And it's only Chinese influence that brought individual plates. First, they were imported. That was the big Portuguese commerce at the time, to have Chinese porcelain, still in English it's called Chinaware, into Europe. And later on the Jesuits transmitted to Europeans, to their letters, how to produce it in Europe. And then you had the big manufactories like Sèvres in Paris, Meissen and so on, which started to produce the plates in a European fashion. But the fact that we use plates is very Chinese. And at the same time, also manners got refined. You know, there was a big bestseller of Erasmus of Rotterdam about table manners. And that was a bestseller till the end of 17th century, beginning of 18th century. And you have some manners that have to be taught to people, like if you eat meat from the big plate in the middle of the table, and you do not eat everything, or there are bones, please do not put them back in the main plate. Throw them gallantly over your shoulder. Or when you eat your soup, there's only one spoon that gets passed around. Do not lick your spoon, but use the tablecloth to clean it and then pass it to your neighbor. Or during meals, do not spit on the table, spit on the floor. So this was a bestseller, I told you, before the beginning of the 18th century. That means it was necessary to repeat these manners to the young generation, because evidently they were not followed. And it's only by the influence of the Orient, with the introduction of plays, that in a certain sense we got civilized. And this whole concept of civilization is linked, of course, in the French word here, civilisation. It was forged in France. It has to do with the culture of Versailles, of Louis XV, more than the 14th. The 14th was still eating with his hands. This notion was very much influenced by this new manner of eating from single plates introduced from Asia. Other things that are considered very European, in the morning we have coffee or tea. Now, coffee, as you know, is a product from Ethiopia. And it was introduced into Arabia because Islam did not allow the drinking of wine. So, to have some exciting beverage, coffee became very popular. And later on it was introduced via Turkey into Europe. But we have, for Arabians, the barbaric way of putting milk into the coffee, which seems very normal to us, but which is a typical example of hybridization of culture. So when an element of another culture gets introduced into our own culture, it becomes hybrid, it becomes transformed. We put milk into the coffee because before in Europe we used to have soup, but we put milk in the soup. Now, having coffee replacing soup, we continued to put milk into it. The same you have now in food globalization. For instance, in Japan we have bread, but in the bread they make some color. So there the bread replaces rice. And it becomes a very different product of what Europe used to do with bread. Tea, of course, comes from China. The word is Chinese, cha, got by the British were not so good at foreign languages, so it became tea with time, or tea. But you know that British tea was only introduced because there was a negative trade balance with China. So in order to buy their tea from China, they tried to, and succeeded in growing the product in India, which is a product of British colonialism. So British tea, which is very British, very European in that sense, in fact comes from Asia. And I just wanted to give you some concrete examples to show how our daily life, in fact, is influenced by the encounter of Asia, and how daily life culture got transformed by this encounter with Asia. And my second thesis is that the people transmitting these cultures were the missionaries. You see, the missionaries used all the trade routes